Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. I'm one half of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, Machel and Santokie, and with me as ever is my partner in crime, Santokie Naikilendran. Santokie, how you doing?
Yeah, Mash, all good. It's been a busy few days for us here at the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. We were both in attendance at the big warm-up game at the county ground in Beckenham, South London for West Indies against the county Select 11. It was good to see, Kavem Hodge hit a century, first time looking at Machel and just seeing West Indies prepare for that big first test against at Lords in the coming few days. So it was good to be at the ground, see a lot of West Indies fans there, which was good to see. But most importantly, Mash, we got to meet a lot of members of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast community. A lot of people have been messaging and supporting the podcast. We got to meet them in real life for the first time. So overall, it was a good day. You were there for 2 days. It was nice to interact with people who have been supporting the movement, Mash.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if we can be in self-indulgent for 30 seconds or so, I think fundamentally what we saw in that tour game, irrespective for a minute of West Indies and the preparations for the England series, we saw that when what we had created in the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, we saw all of that essentially come to fruition at that tour game. We all along from the very beginning, it was never about fame for us or money or anything like that. It was just about let's create a community. Let's draw the different elements of the community together, particularly outside of the Caribbean, who still love West Indies cricket and sometimes struggle to see all the aspects of it drawn together in one place. And that tour game was kind of just a level of validation that the labor of love that we had created had kind of proved to be the right thing to do. Just so many different faces from so many different parts of the UK, abroad, so on and so forth. Just wanting, just all just connecting. And the thing is, yes, we were there, but people just connected in general. Yeah. If you see what I mean, we just happened to be there, and yes, people were hailing us up and etc., but people were just connected in general. So it was really good to see. Hopefully that continues across the 3 test match series, Lords, Trent Bridge and Edgbaston. But, like you say, really positive and means that we have to carry on for another 4 years, Santokie.
So, yeah, Mash, as always, as we say, getting on to the episode, never a dull day in West Indies cricket. We're not actually here to look at the first test at Lords just yet. That'll probably come in the next few days. We're here to dissect an announcement from Cricket West Indies. So, in the past few days, West Indies have announced with gratitude that Desmond Haynes, as lead selector of the men's senior side, and Mrs. Anne Brown-Johnson as lead selector of the senior women's side, both of those, their contract expired last week and they will not be continuing in the role. So we're here specifically, Mash, to look at, the tenure of Desmond Haynes as lead selector. He was appointed in January 2022. So he's had 2.5 years in the roles. We're going to look at the ups and downs, the highs and lows of his role as selector. And I think it's important, Mash, before we get into it, because no doubt we'll get people in the comments and messaging us. This isn't a cuss out on Desmond Haynes as a person, as a player. We know what he was. He was an iconic opening partnership with Gordon Greenwich, not just in West Indies cricket, in world cricket. I think he played over 100 tests. It was 116 test matches, 18 centuries in test cricket, 17 centuries in ODI cricket. So we give respect to Desmond Haynes and his contribution to West Indies cricket. We're here to just analyse his role as lead selector for that West Indies cricket team for the past 2.5 years.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't think we've really got no horse in this race. This is very much just a dispassionate, objective look at his kind of tenure in the role. And I think actually, Santokie, the statement that was put out from Cricket West Indies to me speaks to the fact that it's not even about how good Desmond Haynes was or how good Desi was. It's more about West Indies or Cricket West Indies are trying to move with the times. And this notion of one big figurehead selector with an assistant. So for Des, it was Roland Butcher for a period of time, and then the head coach. I think it's effectively them saying this is outdated. It's an outdated way to pick a cricket team, particularly a cricket side that is made up of so many. No other team has what we have, where you've got to go across a conglomerate of different island nation states to try and pick one team. Everybody, like in England, are picking within the jurisdiction of England and Wales, right? Whereas we have to fly from island to nation, and so on and so forth. And of course, we have the scourge and spectre of insularity, which plagues any kind of selection that's ever made for a West Indies team. So if I just look at that statement in a bit more detail. So Miles Bascombe, the director of cricket, said this, Santokie: Cricket West Indies will continue the quest for excellence in the selection system with ongoing restructuring efforts, including the implementation of new and improved processes. Bascombe elaborated by stating, "We are committed to a selection system that reflects the current needs of our cricketing landscape, which will give us the best chance to identify and develop talent across all levels. The new system will have an increased focus on scouting, depth charting, alignment with cricket strategy, and human resource management. These decisions were taken following careful consideration by the Cricket Development and Performance Committee." Now, Santokie, before we get into Haynes's performance or lack thereof, let's focus on those words. Scouting, which to me implies, I'll hand to you in a sec, but to me implies we need a system which is actually getting out to all of the territories in a kind of equal share and properly looking at what's going on, rather than with respect to Desi and what I think has been going on, which is there's a tournament going on. I as head selector will base myself in one nation within that tournament. So the last first class championship, Desi might base, I'm just speaking hypothetically, Desi might base himself in Trinidad, but that doesn't mean he's seeing the games in Jamaica. Do you see where I'm coming from? Right. So scouting, depth charting, alignment with cricket strategy, which speaks to looking at selection being aligned with what are we trying to achieve. So rather than me as a one selector saying, I like the look of that player, does that player even fit what we're trying to achieve, as opposed to your subjective view on a particular player, if that makes sense? And human resource management. Now, unless I'm mistaken, Santokie, the human resource management must speak to things like, boy, I asked Puran to ring the Ryan, and the Ryan said, he's not coming. So unless I'm mistaken, that's what the human resource management might speak to as well.
Yeah, I think overall, you look at a restructure Cricket West Indies are planning. It's essentially trying to modernize the selection panel, as you say, to be more in line with what other countries do around the world. I think the communication has been a big flaw with the selection panel, not just Desmond Haynes in general. For as far as long as I've been following West Indies cricket, that's always been an issue. So casting the net wider and being able to communicate more, looking more at data and stats, and as you said, not just relying on one person saying, all right, this guy's passed the eye test, and also not relying on the communication skills of one person. So hopefully this restructure benefits West Indies cricket. As you said, we have no real stake in this race. We just want to see what's better for West Indies cricket. So if we cast back, Mash, to you just froze there, Mash. I thought the Wi-Fi was down as well, but we're good. We're back up. For those of you unaware, well, everyone unaware, this is our third time of recording. You know, it's heavy rain in South London. For the first time, Mash's Wi-Fi is even worse than mine. So as long as we can get this episode, we're all good. But Mash, let's talk about the initial stages. So Haynes was appointed January 2022. It's easy to forget he was actually appointed alongside Ramnaresh Sarwan. Was his.
Yeah, do you know? I forgot about. I forgot about that. You know, I actually forgotten that.
Listen, so it was originally the panel was lead selector Desmond Haynes, Sarwan as a fellow selector, not the lead selector, working alongside Haynes, and Phil Simmons. They formed the selection panel. However, Sarwan left in mysterious circumstances about 4 months later. So, Mash, that's also something we haven't really touched on. Sarwan was originally working with Desmond Haynes. We never really got to the bottom of why he left so abruptly.
Do you know what? If you hadn't mentioned that, I would actually never a dull day in West Indies cricket. I would have forgotten that was even a thing that took place, you know. Yeah, we've never got an explanation. And the joke thing is, if I'm not mistaken, I think Sarwan had been part of the looking at how do we update our selection systems. I think he was part of that selection task force review and things like that. And then he got picked as a selector and then just ducked immediately after being picked as selector. So who knows what beef went on there. But then, if I remember, because he was part of Guyana's selection system and then went to West Indies. I can't remember if he went back to Guyana afterwards. But yeah, it was a very weird set of circumstances.
Yeah, so we had Sarwan briefly in the role with Desmond Haynes, and then he was replaced by Roland Butcher. So Mash, if we look at the initial sort of opening period for Desmond Haynes, was he in charge of the selection for the England White Ball series in 2022 January, or had the squad already been picked?
No, I think that squad had already been picked. So I have looked over Haynes's role, because really and truly, because maybe instead of looking at series by series, I tried to break it down in terms of tests, ODIs, and T20s, right? And I think the easiest one to kind of criticize or say, well, nothing improved is ODIs. We were just terrible. We were terrible. We've been terrible. We continue to be terrible. And it's a format of cricket that we are yet to show. Now, Darren Sammy may well listen to this and say, just wait. Okay, cool. But it's a format of cricket we're yet to show any real genuine development in, right? As then kind of signpost by the fact that we didn't even make it to the World Cup, like failed in the World Cup qualifiers, etc. So I think a lot of people who will look at Haynes's role and say it was a failure will point to ODI cricket and the failure to make the 2023 World Cup. I wouldn't pigeonhole his tenure just based on that, but like any head coach or any chairman of selectors or any head selector, you're ultimately judged by your kind of key performance indicators and your performance metrics, right? And it's interesting because when Roland Butcher was removed in December last year, I think it was, he kind of did the media round saying, but we did such a good job. Why have they removed us? We were doing such a great job. This, that, and the third. And I think it was after the Australia tour. It's like, look what's happened in Australia just before. Look what happened in Australia. We picked that squad. That's because we were doing a good job. And I'm not saying there's no validity in that statement from Roland Butcher, but I am saying we didn't qualify for the 2023 World Cup. So it swings in roundabouts for me.
Yeah, I think ODIs, I mean, if you look, even when Haynes took over, we just lost 2-1 to Ireland in ODIs, and we'd been down bad in ODIs before that. So we can't blame Haynes' selections for our downfall in ODI cricket, but there was never a sustained improvement in ODI cricket, and it culminated in not qualifying for the World Cup. I think a lot of people, when talking about ODI cricket as well, inevitably, Mash, this links back to the communications. We've got to talk about post-failure to qualify for the World Cup, the whole Darren Bravo saga, where he said they've invested in the likes of Afanase and Carty. They moved on from Darren Bravo. Yeah, at the same time, they picked Kyle Notley, who was the same age. So I think in recent times, Darren Bravo, and when you referenced it earlier, the failure to sort of contact Narayan, and obviously there was some communication with Hetmar as well, Dre Ross. I think overall, Mash, I think one thing that kind of stood out when people are critiquing Haynes's role as selector was that communication and sort of not the consistency in the messaging that was going out to the public. I will say, however, to Haynes's credit, he did come out in press conferences and did kind of, when he could kind of bat off some of the questions or try to discuss it. So we did get communication with stakeholders on a semi-regular basis from Haynes, but the messaging, in my opinion, Mash, wasn't consistent. There wasn't sort of clarity on what the policy was. Was this a Cricket West Indies policy to discard with the likes of Dan Bravo because he was 34? Or was this Desmond Haynes making an executive decision? We never really got that side of things in terms of communication.
Yeah, that's a very good point you make there. And I always said with Desi that my issue was just optics. And I mean, you and I said it to Kishore Shallow when we had him on the podcast pretty much this time last year, that we score so many own goals in the optics in how we deliver information, to the point where I'd almost say to Cricket West Indies, don't do press conferences, because if nobody has the set line before a press conference of what is the message that we're actually getting out here, then don't let anybody do a press conference, because there were too many gaffes. Under no circumstances should Desi ever have said in a press conference, I asked Nicholas Pooran to ring Narayan to see if he was available. Gaff. Under no circumstances should he ever said in a press conference, I understand that Evan Lewis is building a home. Gaff. Like that, none of this stuff should ever come out in a press conference. We're now going with a youth policy, but now I'm picking Dowrich and Otley. Gaff. Like there was just too many of those type of incidences where it was like, you caused this. No one asked you to say this stuff. You caused this, and the optics look shocking because of what you said. That doesn't mean that you're not a good selector, but it means that it's clouding the judgment of people and your role because you're saying stuff that doesn't make any sense from a kind of objective point of view. So it wouldn't be right if we didn't highlight those things. And whatever they do going forward and whatever the selection committee looks like going forward, that to me has to be the number one thing to solve Santokie. I'm almost telling them that what they have to do is run through the press conference before the press conference starts. Say to the next selector or selection committee, right, what are you planning to say tomorrow? No, don't say that. Don't say that, because we're going to catch pelters if you say that. Like, so there just has to be a bit more of an upskilling in general in terms of communication. The other thing I want to pivot to, Santokie, because I want people to know that we're not just trying to focus on any kind of good job, like Desi didn't do a good job. Let's look at Test cricket briefly. Yeah. Under his tenure, we beat Bangladesh at home, England at home, Zimbabwe away, drew with Australia away, lost to India at home, lost to South Africa away. So 1-3 series, lost 2, drew 1. If you're Desmond Haynes and Roland Butcher, you're looking at those test series and saying, hold on a minute, the test team did well under our selection process. So we were doing a good job. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you're going to look at probably the strength of the selection policy in terms of formats, you'd argue test was where Desmond Haynes sort of, as you point out the results, he'd done better than the other formats. So you could say test cricket has been on the up in recent years. However, also there have been some inconsistencies, like an Nkrumah Bonner, who was a highlight before Haynes came in, him being dropped. However, again, as we all present a balanced argument, there were some calls he made. He finally was the selector that called in Tejnarayan Chanderpaul to the Test cricket arena. We'd been calling for that. Fans have been calling that for a few years beforehand. He pulled the trigger, admittedly enforced because of John Campbell being away, but he pulled the trigger on Tejnarayan Chanderpaul, was rewarded with Chanderpaul hitting that double century against Zimbabwe. So on the whole, Mash, I think it also points to the fact that Desmond Haynes, as we alluded to at the top of the show, iconic Test cricketer. And so his ability for C players who can pass the eye test in red ball cricket, longer form cricket, we did see some of that in his selections for Test cricket.
Should we give him credit for Shamar as well?
Yeah, well, we have to, because people will say, it wasn't them that discovered it. It was Curtly Ambrose who kind of went out. But at the end of the day, it's the selector who makes the call to pick someone for their senior side. And regardless of who discovers Shamar Joseph and the situation that led to him getting called up, he did get called up for a senior tour to Australia. There were other bowlers who could have been called up, less risk averse. They took the risk, they got Shamar Joseph, and it paid off. So I think you do have to give them credit for picking Shamar Joseph. I think there's a distinction between discovering Shamar Joseph and then picking him. I think a lot of people say, they didn't discover Shamar Joseph, is what they kind of mean. But they picked them at the end of the day. They picked Shamar Joseph for that Australia tour. Again, so I think that is a credit to them. So I think on the whole, you could say, Mash, Test cricket was the most successful for this selection panel of mainly Haynes and Roland Butcher. What are your thoughts? Would you?
No, I agree. No, I agree. Good job, Desi, because we could add some other names. As much as we can be critical of we're going forward with youth in terms of ODI cricket, and that I think more so the criticisms with ODI is because we're so terrible at that format that possibly people felt we should have had some experience in there as well. But with Tests, he pulled the trigger on Kurt McKenzie. I'm a fellow Jamaican, and I had my doubts about that selection of Kurt McKenzie. Kurt went to Australia and was our top run scorer in Australia. Desi pulled the trigger on Kirk. Obviously, Ali Cathanes has been brought into the squad as well. Even Multi was brought into the squad under Desi. So there are a series of selections under Desi where you could argue, well, hold on a minute. Good job, Desi. Like, he's picked players who have, the jury might still be out on some of the young ones, but he's picked players and taken a kind of gamble on players who have shown that they have something to offer at the test match level. And if we're gonna say, oh well, boy, let's criticize Desi for the ODI World Cup, you've got to be balanced and say, well, let's praise Desi for his eye for red ball cricket. And in fairness to Desi as well, a lot of the times in press conferences, Desi would always say these guys need to play some more red ball cricket. He would always stress that about all of the players and say, boy, they need to come back home and play a bit more red ball cricket. It'll sharpen up their skills and so on and so forth. So we have to be balanced on this thing.
Yeah, I think so. We can quantify his effect on test ball cricket as effective as a success in terms of test cricket. He's left it in a better place than it was when he's taken over. And I just think, Mash, this just points to my own opinion would be I wouldn't necessarily think Desmond Haynes was suited, particularly to T20 cricket in terms of picking a side. I think we've seen an improvement in T20 cricket because Sammy's been head coach and on the selection panel. A lot of the input has been through Darren Sammy. But I will say, Desmond Haynes, in terms of finding players passing that eye test, looking at the foundations of skills you need in red ball cricket, like you said, someone like a Kirk McKenzie, a lot of people, we had doubts about whether he could come straight into the test side. Desmond Haynes obviously saw something in him and kind of picked him, and Kirk McKenzie's still in the test side. Obviously, it's not a finished product, but he has looked productive at senior level international test cricket. So I think for me, his strength did lie in selections for red ball cricket. And as you said, he was very much an advocate of come back, play domestic cricket, get some more red ball cricket under you, and then we'll go from there. However, Mash, you could also say on the flip side, see a lot of the things there's two arguments to it. On the flip side, you can say his inability to be flexible in terms of expecting players to come back and play domestic cricket with all the T20 contracts and everything was sort of an issue as well. However, I think I know we've talked about Pooran getting picked up and that kind of thing. I think it would take a very brave selector to come in and hand someone like Pooran a test call up. As much as we'd like to see it, I just think there's always going to be a remit to play domestic red ball cricket. So I can't really criticize Desmond Haynes for not taking that big of a risk and going to the likes of Pooran, but I do think it was slightly kind of naive in modern cricket to expect players to drop everything else and play domestic red ball cricket as a priority.
So let me ask you something. I agree with a lot of that, to be fair. You said, by the way, that it's going to take somebody brave to select Pooran for Test cricket. I'm here, Santokie. I'm here. Johnny Grave, I'm outside, Kishore, I'm outside. I'm ready. But where then, okay, because you brought up Sammy there, which is quite interesting. We've just had a T20 World Cup where we didn't make the semis, but I guess you could show, the argument would go that we showed some progression from 2022. Desi was in charge for that, or Desi was the key selector for the 2022 World Cup, where we didn't even make, we won one game in the qualifying stage and didn't even make the main stage. I don't know where we look at it in terms of T20 cricket, because if we say that Sammy takes credit for 2024, are we saying that Desi must take the blame for 2022? Is there a more nuanced argument, which is that there was no real philosophy to our T20 cricket till Sammy came back and tried to build some kind of philosophy? So, and also, is it right that we say that, yeah, Desi, good job, Desi, Test cricket, but even though we just had a relatively positive home World Cup, it's not good job, Desi, either?
That's an interesting one, because I think, as you said, on paper, we can't say, oh, he did a bad job at 2022 World Cup and then not give him plaudits for whatever West Indies did at the 2024 World Cup because he was part of the selection panel there. I just think the thing that Sammy's done is, I think Sammy, as you said, he's built a philosophy, but I'll use Andre Russell as a good comparison. Andre Russell wasn't called up in 2022. Phil Simmons and Haynes were on the panel.
And they actually said they'd moved past him as well, in fairness. Yeah,
exactly. Suddenly, fast forward a year later, Russell's back in that team for the England series, December 2023. Commits, plays against Australia, plays in the World Cup, commits everything to West Indies. Even says now, like, he'll retire, but if West Indies need him, he's there. The only thing that's changed in the makeup of the selection panel is Sammy. Sammy's coming for Simmons. So for me, someone like Andre Russell, do we give Desmond Haynes credit for Russell being back in the West Indies team, bearing in mind he said we'd move past him, or is that just something we say, all right, that's basically Sammy came in and made the executive decision, and we give all the credit to Sammy? It's an interesting one because there's a few complexities to it.
No, that's a very good point. It's a very good point. And one that I'm not even going to add anything further to. I'll let the people watching this get in the comments below, because I actually think it's a very good point from Santokie. Clearly, Russell was brought back because of Sammy. Because as far as we were concerned in the media, it had been made very obvious that they'd moved on past someone like Dre Russ, and Dre Russ went on to have a good World Cup, certainly with the ball. Let's finish with this one, Santokie. The youth man policy.
Yeah.
Now, I've spoken about Athenaeus, I've spoken about Mackenzie, etc. Youth man up. They took Teddy Bishop to Australia. What do I want to say here? Do you see youth man policy as a... Okay, I'll try and link it to Arteta, right? Arsenal fans about to get in the mentions. But Arteta and everyone talks about Arsenal's youth man policy, etc. Sometimes I think picking youth man is like an easy get out clause, because you know that everyone's rallying around youth man. It's like, well, you know, they're only young. We have to rally around the youth man and so on. And that's not to say that I'm not rallying around them. I think people like Athenaeus have serious quality, etc. But you almost insulate yourself from criticism when you pick youth man and saying you're going with a youth man policy, because it basically means you're saying to everyone, we got to give them time. So if then L's come, it's like, well, you know, we got to give them time. I was always a bit worried about youth man policy, because was it youth man policy? This is my question. Everyone who's watching, get in the comments below. Was it youth man policy because of a genuine scouting, real identification of talent, and they were the next best option? Or was it youth man policy, boy, I don't know what else to do, let's just go with youth man, because what else are we gonna do now? Do you get where I'm coming from? And I never quite got, for myself, this is me now talking, I never knew where the line was with that. And I just worry sometimes with youth man policy that it deliberately prevents you from being critiqued, because who critiques youth man, if you see what I mean?
And the worrying sign I think all West Indies fans will be worried about is, we've seen it before in 2015 when they gave Jason Holder the captaincy and they went with the youth man policy. You know, this side, our test side, our ODI side, we're going to have it with men under 25. We have to stick with them long term. But then, as you said, Mash, that almost gives you a get out card, because then it's essentially saying every time we take a loss, you know, it's a learning experience. It's a learning
building for the future.
But then if you look at the original generation of that youth man policy, 2015, it never went anywhere. We just took licks, and we're still continuing to take licks. So the youth policy, unless there's a tangible end, unless it pays off in like 2-3 years with a successful team, it's always going to be a troublesome one. And I think something like the Darren Bravo call as well, it's all good having a youth man policy, but then are you saying someone who's 34, we're just discarding him forever because we're going with a youth man policy? It just seems as if you're basically picking and choosing what is a youth man policy to kind of, because you don't know what else to do, basically. It just seemed mixed. It didn't seem, and also there was no sort of, it was suddenly, we didn't qualify for a World Cup, we're just going to go with a youth man policy now. That's it. We're looking at next 4-year cycle. It just didn't really make any sense. And no other teams, I think, more importantly, if you look at other teams around the world, no other teams ever go with a youth man policy. They have a few youth players in, but they generally keep experienced players in the side. So for me, the youth man policy, as you said, is just a reason to kind of deflect any criticism by saying we've gone with young guys, give them time. Anyone who criticizes them is being unfair because these are young men and they're learning. However, it's a professional sport. You ultimately have to pick sides that can win series, essentially. And that's you've got to have that balance of experience. So for me, I think the uproar was justified at the end of last year with the Darren Bravo thing, just because it just felt like it felt like it was a scattergun approach. It didn't feel like it was a policy that had been thought out. It was sort of just said, as you said, Mash, it was almost said ad hoc at a press conference. We're done with Bravo. We're going with the youth man policy. And then they picked Athenaeus and Carty as two players to identify with that with. So for me, I think it could have been worded a bit better at the press conference, but the fact it came out like that just felt like we were going with a whole thing. With anyone over 32, 33 is gone for West Indies cricket. We're going with youth man policy.
And this is therefore why, Santokie, I go full circle. Miles Bascombe, director of cricket, said, "We have to give ourselves the best chance to identify and develop talent across all levels. We are revamping the selection system with an increased focus on scouting, depth charting, alignment with strategy, and human resource management." Everybody who's listened to this episode, whatever you believe about Desi and Roland Butcher and the last 2.5 years of selection, clearly something new is afoot. And it's going to be very, very interesting, Santokie, to see what that new system looks like. And more importantly than that, Santokie, the system still will have to have a figurehead. So who is the figurehead of that system and who gives the comms around selections going forward? Because West Indies cricket is West Indies cricket. Someone always has to be the scapegoat. Someone always has to catch the cuss out. So it's going to be very, very interesting moving forward, whether people thought Desi was doing a good job, whether they thought he was doing a par or subpar job. It's going to be very interesting now to see who is the face of selection and who catches the pelters when selection goes wrong.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see who they go for and the composition of the panel and what changes it makes, Mash. So I think what are we going to do? We're going to leave it up for the viewers to comment if you think Desmond Haynes' tenure as a selector. As we said, it's a very nuanced argument. There's no simplistic yes or no. But what do you think? Do you think his 2.5 years in the role have been a success for West Indies cricket? Has it benefited West Indies cricket? Or do you think West Indies cricket is in a worse place since he took over? Comment below. It'd be interesting to get a discussion going. So comment whether you think or not. And, you know, if we get enough comments, or we might do a follow-up video to sort of address the points or look into it a bit more. But this was, Mash, as you said, just a quick analysis to sort of, you know, break down what we thought about Desmond Haynes' reign as a selector for the past 2.5 years.
Most definitely. And people, as ever, loads of content coming. Lord's Test starts on Wednesday, so you can expect loads of content. We're just trying to finalize some details around what that looks like in terms of Lord's is stuffy, people. They don't like... Boy, let me just shut my mouth. But anyway, Lord's is stuffy, people. So we have to see how we can get the content out. But you can rest assured that there will be content for that test match. So stay locked in, stay tuned for the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Loads coming in the next week, and see you all soon. Peace.
We rule the cricket world. Now the rules seem coming.
Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans.